Talk of the Trollway spotlights Mount Horeb, Wisconsin's unique artists, entertainers, hobbyists, and personalities. Funding for Talk of the Trollway is provided by Miller & Sons Supermarket.
If you're not sure where to find Alex Bledsoe's work at the local bookstore, you're not alone. The Mount Horeb author got his big break by combining two genres: the hard-boiled detective story epitomized by Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett, and the sword and sorcery tale by way of Lord of the Rings. The combination can be hard to pigeonhole. On this episode of Talk of the Trollway, we'll explore his creative process, the myth of writer's block, and the benefits of living in Mount Horeb, Wisconsin. I'm your host, Gary Schutz.
I got started as a writer, like a lot of writers do. I was writing as a kid. The earliest thing I remember writing was taking a Batman comic book story and turning it into a prose story on my dad's old manual typewriter. And I typed all the way to the edges on all the sheets because I was making the most of it. And then I got in trouble because my dad's typewriter was only to be used for typing up the minutes of the church session, because he was a church elder. So even the very first thing I wrote was an offense to God. And then the first thing I had published was when I was 14. I had a movie review of Star Wars published in a local newspaper. And the first book I had published was in 2007. And in between those, I was constantly writing and always trying to improve what I was doing and trying to figure out what I wanted to write about, because every writer start by writing what they're reading, and then they progress past that if they're good and diligent into figuring out what their own voice is and what sort of things they want to write about that aren't the things that everybody else is writing about. I started writing it when I was 18, and it was finally published when I was 44. So it took a while. It took a while to find out how I wanted to tell the story. It took a while to find for the publishing industry to reach a point where they would accept a story that wasn't entirely one thing. It wasn't just a fantasy. It was also a mystery story. It was also a detective story. And for a long time, there was a lot of resistance to that sort of genre blending. It's very common now, and everybody does it now. Sure. But for a long time, and it boils down to, if you don't know what to call it, where are you going to shelve it? Where are people going to look for it?
On the bookstore end of things. On the bookstore, in the library, any places like that, in the catalogs that the book companies send out. You have to know what to call it. And if there's a question about that, they can't do anything with it. And it has nothing to do with quality of writing or whether the editor likes the story or not. It's strictly a market-driven decision. And that's very frustrating for somebody who's trying to get what they believe is a good story out there. I started writing that book when I was a senior in high school back in 1980, and I'd say the first third of the story has not significantly changed since then. The latter two-thirds changed a lot, but that first third that set up the characters and the plot remained pretty much the same all the way through to the finished book. And that was another example of finding the voice to tell the story, because I wrote on it many different drafts over the years, and it never worked. It never came to life until finally I realized what I was doing wrong in the method of telling the story. I needed to change that, and when I changed that, it just came right to life, and it was really easy to write then. And it's so easy that I've written 4 sequels to it. When I was a kid, like everybody, I read big epic fantasy. I read Conan the Barbarian stories. I read The Lord of the Rings, and I was trying to turn this story into one of those, because it has warriors, it has kings, it has sorceresses, it has magic, it has all the ingredients. Excuse me. But it just wasn't working. That's just not the kind of story I can tell well, given my particular perspective on things. And I pounded at it and pounded at it, took it in a bunch of different directions. And finally, I realized that my problem was that I was pulling from the wrong influences. I also enjoy really reading the classic noir detective writers, Raymond Chandler, Dashiell Hammett, people like that. And I realized, I should be telling this story, but pulling from those influences. So I changed it to a first-person narrator. I changed his profession a little bit. I put in more humor, and it just came to life. It just created its own world around the story that way.
Now, you mentioned The Sword Edge Blonde was the first story you wrote.
Right.
The first that was published.
Right.
Was that the first that you submitted?
No, I was submitting stuff all along. I was writing all kinds of things all along. I had about 50 short stories published in various magazines by the time the book came out. Some of them were good, some of them weren't so good, but you know, they helped me build up a kind of a resume so that when I approached an agent and she approached a publisher, it was clear that I wasn't just a beginner. I'm not sure what the typical break-in approach is now, because just in the time since I've been, publishing, the whole industry has changed. And I'm not sure what you do now to attract attention. I know that a lot of it has to do with your internet presence. You have to have blogs. You have to be active on Twitter and Facebook. You have to already basically be building your professional brand as a writer before you've sold any books or stories. And it's a different world now. I mean, I do all that stuff, but I did it after I started publishing. I've had a blog since my first book came out, and I've had a website since then, and I'm on Twitter and Facebook and Google Plus and all the social networks you have to be on now. Because a big difference now in publishing overall from when I was a kid is readers expect to be able to contact you. I mean, when I was a kid, if I wanted to write Isaac Asimov a letter, I might be lucky enough to figure out where to send it to his publisher. I was not going to be able to find his address anywhere. And now, if you read a book you like, you look online and you find the person's website and you send an email through that, or you leave a comment on their Facebook page, and there's a whole different level of interaction. And, from my perspective, personally, I've really enjoyed that. I've had very, very few awkward encounters that way. It's all been pretty much entirely positive. There seems to be a resurgence of interest in physical books. For a long time, people were saying the physical book was going away. But I have talked to a lot of people at conventions and things like that where they say, I tried reading on ebooks, but I just can't read certain things that way. I need that physical book in my hand. And a lot of the stuff are novels, are fantasy stories that require a little more effort than, say, the light beach type reading that a lot of people read. And I think that, as long as there is a difference in what people need for the reading experience, that there will be room for ebooks and physical books too.
Sure. Neither are going away.
I don't think so, no. And I don't think either should. I think, they're both useful, they both have their good sides. I enjoy both, so.
How have you been able to find success in both areas? You have a number of series of books both in traditional print and the Firefly Witch series.
Yeah.
You've got, I think, 3 or 4 of those.
Yeah, there's 4, and there's about to be a 5th one. And hopefully more after that.
But how are you seeing success in those areas? Do you approach an ebook differently than a traditional book? Is
no,
it the same process?
It's storytelling, and the forum is not that important. The important thing is telling the story well, and people are still reading the words. They may be reading them on paper or on a screen, but it's the words that are important.
Sure. Do you write beginning to end? Do you
Yes.
start page 1, chapter 1, it was a dark and stormy night,
Yep.
and they lived happily ever after?
Yep. I have not always done it that way, but I have found that my writing process works better that way. The hardest part of any novel writing for me is writing that first draft. That is like they say, pulling teeth. It is agony. Once I have a first draft completed, once the story exists in front of me, then I can start revising, and I love that. I'll revise till doomsday. I love going back through stuff and finding little ways to tweak it and make it more unique and interesting. So I sort of figure they pay me for writing the first draft, because I do the other stuff for fun. I have a daily schedule. I try to get up between 4 and 5 and do some writing before the kids get up. And then after the kids go to school, it depends on where I am in the project. If I'm still writing the first draft, I'll stay home and write. If I'm editing, that's when I'll go downtown and sit down there. And then I'll make changes on a physical hard copy of the manuscript and then come back and put those into the file of the manuscript and then print that out to do another revision. I tend to do my writing here at home just because that's sort of my habit now. I edit after I've written something. I like to go somewhere where I'm not likely to be distracted by my computer or the TV or the children or something like that. I like to get away and just be somewhere. And it sounds counterintuitive, but the noise at the chocolate shop actually functions as a kind of white noise and makes it actually much easier to concentrate than dead silence. So it's a perfect environment, at least for me. Writing is like any sort of activity. It's like athletics. Athletes practice every day, even though they may only play in a game on one day out of the week. But they're practicing every day and they're getting better. Writing is the exact same way. You may not have the best idea for a story, but the more you write, the better you're going to get at it, and the more prepared you're going to be for having that really good idea. Because a great idea on somebody who doesn't have the technical skill to develop it is wasted. I don't believe in writer's block. When it's your job, you don't have writer's block. Plumbers don't have plumber's block. House painters don't have house painter block. Writers, you're gonna have off days. You're gonna have days when what you write is not very good. You're gonna have days when it just doesn't flow. But if it's your job, you sit down and you put in the time anyway. And the more you do that, the less often those times are going to come up.
Eddie LaCrosse, there's an obvious, well, I think it's obvious, connection to Wisconsin there.
Yeah.
But did that happen after you moved to Wisconsin?
No.
That happened before you were in Wisconsin when you found the name Eddie LaCrosse.
That's the irony. When I was working on this story in Tennessee, I needed place names. And one of the things that bugs me about traditional fantasy is unpronounceable names. Names that have two commas in them or no vowels and that all comes from H.P. Lovecraft who used to do that stuff. But in his stories, he always said this is the closest a human voice can come to these names. That kind of got lost in the shuffle, and a lot of people thought, oh, well, I have to have unpronounceable words if it's going to be a fantasy novel.
Sure.
That drives me crazy. Takes me completely out of the story. So I said, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to name my character Eddie. And all my other characters are going to have normal names. Well, then I started looking at where to name these places, and I thought, I could make up names, but I think I'll look around for place names that sound like they might be made-up fantasy names. And remember, I'm living in Tennessee at the time with no concept of ever moving to Wisconsin. But looking around online, I find great names, and they're all in Wisconsin. So I used those names for some of the cities and everything. Boscobel is in there. Poisippi is in there. Poisippi I love. I still want to find out what the etymology of that is, because that's just great. And then, of course, the irony is, and this is before the book is published or even accepted by a publisher, I moved to Wisconsin. And, I think, oh, well, we'll just leave them. What are the chances here? And, of course, the book comes out, and I'm in Wisconsin, and the book has all these Wisconsin names. And now it's become just kind of a thing I have to do. If I have a city in a story, I have to find a Wisconsin sort of, sometimes I change them. Sometimes I tweak them a little. But sure. There's a town called Muscata, which I changed into Muscodia for a country's name. But it's just the thing you do now. It's just one of the tropes of the story.
What sort of influence has Mount Horeb pushed into your books?
Well, I love the fact that there are trolls everywhere. For a fantasy writer, you can't ask for a better place than that. It just kind of lends itself to your natural thought processes. The fact that it is a small town, the fact that I know all my neighbors, I know all the people I see in town. You don't know how small a town it is? When we first moved into this house, I went down to get the electricity turned on, and I walked into the city hall and told them my name, and they said, "Oh, you bought that big yellow house on 5th Street." That's how small a town it is. And it's a very comforting environment to work in. I mean, I used to live in Madison. I've tried to work, I've worked in the big city. I've tried to, be part of that arts community there, but it's not the pace and not the style that suits me. This kind of environment suits me. I'm friends with, a local playwright. I'm friends with the people that run the theatrical school. I know musicians in town, and I love having that around me. And you could have that around you any place, I assume, but there just seems to be a particular friendliness to it here. For a town as small as it is, it has a very active arts aspect to it. I mean, you have 2 art galleries right downtown, you have artists all over town, and you have, those little free libraries are even springing up all over the place. I know of 4 of them in town, and in this little bitty town. So yeah, I think I couldn't have landed anywhere better than Mount Horeb.
Books of yours that I'm most familiar with are the Eddie LaCrosse books.
Yeah.
And I've read, I'll say most of them.
Okay.
No trolls. You pointed out that you like having trolls around.
Just
why haven't there been any trolls in the books?
The stories that I've told in those have just not lent themselves to trolls yet.
Well, that's
and I've got, if I'm going to put a troll in it now, it's got to be perfect. I can't slack up on putting trolls in. I got to nail it dead on.
Any advice for other writers?
Write as much as you can. And I know that's a cliche, but again, it's like anything you do, the more you do it, the better you'll get at it. Don't be afraid to finish things. So many beginning writers, so many struggling writers will start something and they won't finish it. And they'll have stacks of reasons why. Oh, I don't have time, or my kids are sick, or blah, blah, blah. No. The reason you don't want to finish it is because when it's finished, it can be judged. When it's finished, somebody can say whether they like it or not. Don't be afraid of that. Nobody's going to like everything. Somebody's going to hate it. But you can't progress until you finish and until you see what people think about it, because there will always be somebody who gives you some bit of input that makes you go, crap, you're right. I have to fix this.
How have you gotten past that judgmental stage?
Fear. I am terrified of missing deadlines. I am terrified of not getting paid. No, again, I chalk that up to journalism, because you don't have time to dwell on it. You have to bang it out and you have to finish it. You can't write 2/3 of it and put it away for a while. I mean, it's a little different, but the emotional place that comes from is entirely from journalism. That just sense that my job is to finish this, and it is a job. It's an art in a sense, because you are creating something where there wasn't anything there before. But it's a job, and if you treat it like a job, you will find that the art becomes much easier.
I'm not going to drone on and on about the next episode of Talk of the Trollway, but I will tell you that we're going to take a little flight of fancy with Dave Kunkel and his unique perspective on the world, including the village of Mount Horeb. I'm your host, Gary Schutz.
Talk of the Trollway is a production of Trollway TV, Mount Horeb, Wisconsin's village cable station. Funding for Talk of the Trollway is provided by Miller & Sons Supermarket. Talk of the Trollway is on Facebook, where your comments and story ideas are welcome.